2. Though our new-made foretopman was well received in the top and on the gun-decks, hardly here was he that cynosure he had previously been among those minor ships companies of the merchant marine, with which companies only had he hitherto consorted. He was young, and despite his all but fully developed frame, in aspect, looked even younger than he really was, owing to a lingering adolescent expression in the as yet smooth face, all but feminine in purity of natural complexion, but where, thanks to his sea-going, the lily was quite suppressed, and the rose had some ado visibly to flush through the tan. To one essentially such a novice in the complexities of factitious life, the abrupt transition from his former and simpler sphere to the ampler and more knowing world of a great warship, this might well have abashed him had there been any conceit or vanity in his composition. Among her miscellaneous multitude, the bellipotent mustered several individuals who, however inferior in grade, were of no common natural stamp, sailors more signally susceptive of that air which continuous martial discipline and repeated presence in battle can in some degree impart even to the average man. As the handsome sailor, Billy Budd's position aboard the 74 was something analogous to that of a rustic beauty transplanted from the provinces and brought into competition with the high-born dames of the court. But this change of circumstances he scarce noted. As little did he observe that something about him provoked an ambiguous smile in one or two harder faces among the bluejackets. Nor less unaware was he of the peculiar favorable effect his person and demeanor had upon the more intelligent gentlemen of the quarter-deck. Nor could this well have been otherwise, cast in a mould peculiar to the finest physical examples of those Englishmen in whom the Saxon strain would seem not at all to partake of any Norman or other admixture. He showed in face that humane look of reposeful good nature which the Greek sculptor in some instances gave to his heroic strongman, Hercules. But this again was subtly modified by another and pervasive quality, the ear, small and shapely, the arch of the foot, the curve in mouth and nostril, even the indurated hand, dyed to the orange tawny of a toucan's bill, a hand telling alike of the halyards and tar-bucket, but above all, something in the mobile expression and every chance attitude and movement, something suggestive of a mother eminently favored by love and the graces. All this strangely indicated a lineage in direct contradiction to his lot. The mysteriousness here became less mysterious through a matter of fact elicited when Billy, at the capstan, was being formally mustered into the service. Asked by the officer, a small, brisk little gentleman, as it chanced among other questions, his place of birth, he replied, "Please, sir, I don't know." "Don't know where you were born? Who was your father?" "God knows, sir." Struck by the straightforward simplicity of these replies, the officer next asked, "Do you know anything about your beginning?" "No, sir, but I have heard that I was found in a pretty silk-lined basket, hanging one morning from the knocker of a good man's door in Bristol." "Found, say you? Well, throwing back his head and looking up and down the new recruit. "Well, it turns out to have been a pretty good find. Hope they'll find some more like you, my man. The fleet sadly needs them." Yes, Billy Budd was a foundling, a presumable bye-blow, and evidently no ignoble one. Noble descent was as evident in him as in a blood-horse. For the rest, with little or no sharpness of faculty or any trace of the wisdom of the serpent, nor yet quite a dove, he possessed that kind and degree of intelligence going along with the unconventional rectitude of a sound human creature, one to whom not yet has been preferred the questionable apple of knowledge. He was illiterate. He could not read, but he could sing, and like the illiterate, Nightingale was sometimes the composer of his own song. Of self-consciousness he seemed to have little or none, or about as much as we may reasonably impute to a dog of St. Bernard's breed. Habitually living with the elements and knowing little more of the land than as a bench, or rather that portion of the terraqueous globe providentially set apart for dance-houses, doxies, and tapsters, in short, what sailors call a fiddler's green, his simple nature remained unsophisticated by those moral obliquities which are not in every case incompatible with the manufacturable thing known as respectability. But are sailors, frequenters of fiddlers' greens, without vices? No, but less often than with lads men do their vices, so-called partake of crookedness of heart, seeming less to proceed from viciousness than exuberance of vitality after long constraint, frank manifestations in accordance with natural law. By his original constitution, aided by the cooperating influences of his lot, Billy, in many respects, was little more than a sort of upright barbarian. Much such, perhaps, as Adam presumably might have been ere the urbine serpent wriggled himself into his company. And here be it submitted that apparently going to corroborate the doctrine of man's fall, a doctrine now popularly ignored, it is observable that where certain virtues pristine and unadulterate peculiarly characterize anybody in the external uniform of civilization, they will, upon scrutiny, seem not to be derived from custom or convention, but rather to be out of keeping with these, as if indeed exceptionally transmitted from a period prior to Cane City and setified man. The character marked by such qualities has an unvitiated taste and untampered with flavor like that of berries, while the man thoroughly civilized, even in a fair specimen of the breed, has to the same moral palate a questionable smack of a compounded wine. To any stray inheritor of these primitive qualities found, like Caspar Hauser, wandering dazed in any Christian capital of our time, the good-natured poet's famous invocation near 2,000 years ago of the good rustic out of his latitude in the Rome of the Caesars still appropriately holds. Honest and poor, faithful in word and thought, what hath thee, Fabian, to the city brought? Though our handsome sailor had as much of masculine beauty as one can expect anywhere to see, nevertheless, like the beautiful women in one of Hawthorne's minor tales, there was just one thing amiss in him. No visible blemish indeed, as with the lady, no, but an occasional liability to a vocal defect. Though in the hour of elemental uproar or peril he was everything that a sailor should be, yet under sudden provocation of strong heart-feeling, his voice, otherwise singularly musical, as if expressive of the harmony within, was apt to develop an organic hesitancy, in fact, more or less of a stutter, or even worse. In this particular, Billy was a striking instance that the arch interferer, the envious marplot of Eden, still has more or less to do with every human consignment to this planet of earth. In every case, one way or another, he is sure to slip in his little card, as much as to remind us, I too have a hand here. The avowal of such an imperfection in the handsome sailor should be evidence not alone that he is not presented as a conventional hero, but also that the story in which he is the main figure is no romance. Three. At the time of Billy Budd's arbitrary enlistment into the Bellipotent, that ship was on her way to join the Mediterranean fleet. No long time elapsed before the junction was effected. As one of that fleet, the 74 participated in its movements, though at times, on account of her superior sailing qualities, in the absence of frigates dispatched on separate duty, as a scout, and at times on less temporary service. But with all this the story has little concernment, restricted as it is to the inner life of one particular ship and the career of an individual sailor. It was the summer of 1797. In the April of that year had occurred the commotion at Spithead, followed in May by a second and yet more serious outbreak in the fleet at the Nore. The later is known, and without exaggeration, in the epithet as the Great Mutiny. It was indeed a demonstration more menacing to England than the contemporary manifestoes and conquering and proselyting armies of the French Directory. To the British Empire, the Nore Mutiny was what a strike in the fire brigade would be to London threatened by general arson. In a crisis when the kingdom might well have anticipated the famous signal that some years later published along the naval line of battle what it was that, upon occasion, England expected of Englishmen, that was the time when at the mastheads of the 3-deckers and 74s moored in her own roadstead, a fleet, the right arm of a power then all but the sole free conservative one of the old world, the Bluejackets, to be numbered by thousands, ran up with huzzas, the British colours with the Union and Cross wiped out, by that cancellation transmuting the flag of founded law and freedom defined into the enemy's red meteor of unbridled and unbounded revolt. Reasonable discontent growing out of practical grievances in the fleet had been ignited into irrational combustion, as by live cinders blown across the channel from France in flames. The event converted into irony for a time those spirited strains of Dibdin, as a songwriter no mean auxiliary to the English government at the European conjuncture, strains celebrating, among other things, the patriotic devotion of the British tar, and as for my life, 'tis the King's. Such an episode in the island's grand naval story her naval historians naturally abridge, one of them, William James, candidly acknowledging that fain would he pass it over, did not partiality forbid fastidiousness, and yet his mention is less a narration than a reference, having to do hardly at all with details, nor are these readily to be found in the libraries. Like some other events in every age befalling states everywhere, including America, the Great Mutiny was of such character that national pride, along with views of policy, would fain shade it off into the historical background. Such events cannot be ignored, but there is a considerate way of historically treating them. If a well-constituted individual refrains from blasooning aught amiss or calamitous in his family, a nation, in the like circumstance, may without reproach be equally discreet. Though after parleyings between government and the ringleaders, the concessions by the former as to some glaring abuses, the first uprising, that at Spithead, with difficulty was put down, or matters for the time pacified. Yet at the Nore, the unforeseen renewal of insurrection on a yet larger scale, and emphasized in the conferences that ensued by demands deemed by the authorities not only inadmissible but aggressively insolent, indicated, if the red flag did not sufficiently do so, what was the spirit animating the men. Final suppression, however, there was, but only made possible perhaps by the unswerving loyalty of the Marine Corps and a voluntary resumption of loyalty among influential sections of the crews. To some extent, the Nore Mutiny may be regarded as analogous to the distempering eruption of contagious fever in a frame constitutionally sound, and which anon throws it off. At all events, of these thousands of mutineers were some of the tars who, not so very long afterwards, whether wholly prompted thereto by patriotism or pugnacious instinct, or by both, helped to win a coronet for Nelson at the Nile, and the naval crown of crowns for him at Trafalgar. To the mutineers, those battles, and especially Trafalgar, were a plenary absolution and a grand one. For all that goes to make up scenic naval display and heroic magnificence in arms, those battles, especially Trafalgar, stand unmatched in human annals. 4. In this matter of writing resolve, as one made to keep to the main road, some bypaths have an enticement not readily to be withstood. I am going to err in such a bypath. If the reader will keep me company, I shall be glad. At the least, we can promise ourselves that pleasure, which is wickedly said to be in sinning, for a literary sin the divergence will be. Very likely, it is no new remark that the inventions of our time have at last brought about a change in sea warfare, in degree corresponding to the revolution in all warfare, effected by the original introduction from China into Europe of gunpowder. The first European firearm, a clumsy contrivance, was, as it well known, scouted by no few of the knights as a base implement, good enough, peradventure, for weavers to craven to stand up crossing steel with steel in frank fight. But as a sure knightly valor, though shorn of its blazonry, did not cease with the knights neither on the seas, though nowadays in encounters there a certain kind of displayed gallantry be fallen out of date as hardly applicable under changed circumstances. Did the nobler qualities of such naval magnates as Don John of Austria, Doria, Van Tromp, Jane Bart, the long line of British admirals, and the American Decatur's of 1812 became obsolete with their wooden walls. Nevertheless, To anybody who can hold the present at its worth without being inappreciative of the past, it may be forgiven. If to such an one the solitary old hulk at Portsmouth, Nelson's Victory, seems to float there, not alone as the decaying monument of a fame incorruptible, but also as a poetic reproach, softened by its picturesqueness to the monitors and yet mightier hulls of the European ironclads. And this not altogether because such craft are unsightly, unavoidably lacking the symmetry and grand lines of the old battleships, but equally for other reasons. There are some, perhaps, who, while not altogether inaccessible to the poetic reproach just alluded to, may yet on behalf of a new order be disposed to parry it, and this to the extent of iconoclasm, if need be. For example, prompted by the sight of the star inserted in the Victory's quarterdeck designated the spot where the great sailor fell, these martial utilitarians may suggest considerations implying that Nelson's ornate publication of his person in battle was not only unnecessary, but not military, nay, savored of foolhardiness and vanity. They may add, too, that at Trafalgar it was in effect nothing less than a challenge to death, and death came, and that but for his bravado the victorious admiral might possibly have survived the battle. And so, instead of having his sagacious dying injunctions overruled by his immediate successor in command, he himself, when the contest was decided, might have brought his shattered fleet to anchor, a proceeding which might have averted the deplorable loss of life by shipwreck in the elemental tempest that followed the martial one. Well, should we set aside the more than disputable point whether, for various reasons, it is possible to anchor the fleet, then plausibly enough the Benthamites of war may urge the above. But the might have been is but boggy ground to build on, and certainly in foresight as to the larger issue of an encounter, and anxious preparations for it, buoying the deadly way and mapping it out, as at Copenhagen few commanders have been so painstakingly circumspect as this same reckless declarer of his person in fight. Personal prudence, even when dictated by quite another than selfish consideration, surely is no special virtue in a military man, while an excessive love of glory impassioning a less burning impulse, the honest sense of duty is the first. If the name Wellington is not so much of a trumpet to the blood as the simpler name Nelson, the reason for this may perhaps be inferred from the above. Alfred, in his funeral ode on the victor of Waterloo, ventures not to call him the greatest soldier of all time, though in the same ode he invokes Nelson as the greatest sailor since our world began. At Trafalgar, Nelson, on the brink of opening the fight, sat down and wrote his last brief will and testament. If under the presentment of the most magnificent of all victories to be crowned by his own glorious death, a sort of priestly motive led him to dress his person in the jeweled vouchers of his own shining deeds, if thus to have adorned him for the altar and the sacrifice, where indeed vainglory, then affectation, and Faustian is each more heroic line in the great epics and dramas, since in such lines the poet but embodies in verse those exaltations of sentiment that a nature like Nelson, the opportunity being given, vitalizes into acts. Five. Yes, the outbreak at the Nore was put down, but not every grievance was redressed. If the contractors, for example, were no longer permitted to ply some practices peculiar to their tribe everywhere, such as providing shoddy cloth, rations, not sound or false in the measure, not the less impressment, for one thing, went on. By custom sanctioned for centuries, and judicially maintained by a Lord Chancellor as late as Mansfield, that mode of manning the fleet, a mode now fallen into a sort of abeyance, but never formally renounced, it was not practicable to give up in those years. Its abrogation would have crippled the indispensable fleet, one wholly under canvas, no steam power, its innumerable sails and thousands of cannon, everything, in short, worked by muscle alone, a fleet the more insatiate in demand for men, because then multiplying its ships of all grades against contingencies present and to come of the convulsed continent. Discontent foreran the two mutinies, and more or less it lurkingly survived them. Hence it was not unreasonable to apprehend some return of trouble, sporadic or general. One instance of such apprehensions, in the same year with this story, Nelson, then Rear Admiral Sir Horatio, being with the fleet off the Spanish coast, was directed by the admiral in command to shift his pennant from the captain to the Theseus, and for this reason, that the latter ship, having newly arrived on the station from home, where it had taken part in the great mutiny, danger was apprehended from the temper of the men, and it was thought that an officer like Nelson was the one, not indeed to terrorize the crew into base subjection, but to win them by force of his mere presence and heroic personality back to an allegiance, if not as enthusiastic as his own, yet as true. So it was that for a time, on more than one quarter-deck, anxiety did exist. At sea, precautionary vigilance was strained against relapse. At short notice, an engagement might come on. When it did, the lieutenants assigned to batteries felt it incumbent on them, in some instances, to stand with drawn swords behind the men working the guns. But on board the 74 in which Billy now swung his hammock, very little in the manner of the men, and nothing obvious in the demeanor of the officers, would have suggested to an ordinary observer that the great mutiny was a recent event. In their general bearing and conduct, the commissioned officers of a warship naturally take their tone from the commander. That is, if he had that ascendancy of character, that ought to be his. Captain, the Honourable Edward Fairfax Vere, to give his full title, was a bachelor of 40 or thereabouts, a sailor of distinction, even in a time prolific of renowned seamen. Though allied to the higher nobility, his advancement had not been altogether owing to influences connected with that circumstance. He had seen much service, been in various engagements, always acquitting himself as an officer mindful of the welfare of his men, but never tolerating an infraction of discipline, thoroughly versed in the science of his profession, and intrepid to the verge of temerity, though never injudiciously so. For his gallantry in the West Indian waters, as flag lieutenant under Rodney, in that admiral's crowning victory over de Grasse, he was made a post-captain. Ashore in the garb of a civilian, scarce anyone would have taken him for a sailor, more especially that he never garnished unprofessional talk with nautical terms, and grave in his bearing, evinced little appreciation. Oh my God. Let's try that again. Ashore, in the garb of a civilian, scarce anyone would have taken him for a sailor, more especially that he never garnished unprofessional talk with nautical terms, and grave in his bearing, evinced little appreciation of mere humor. It was not out of keeping with these traits that on a passage when nothing demanded his paramount action, he was the most undemonstrative of men. Any landsman, observing this gentleman, not conspicuous by his stature, and wearing no profound insignia, emerging from his cabin to the open deck, and noting the silent deference of the officers retiring to leeward, might have taken him for the king's guest, a civilian aboard the king's ship, some highly honorable, discreet envoy on his way to an important post. But in fact, this unobtrusiveness of demeanor may have proceeded from a certain unaffected modesty of manhood sometimes accompanying a resolute nature, a modesty evinced at all times not calling for pronounced action, which shone in any rank of life suggest a virtue aristocratic in kind. As with some others engaged in various departments of the world's more heroic activities, Captain Vere, though practical enough upon occasion, would at times betray a certain dreaminess of mood. Standing alone on the weather side of the quarter-deck, one hand holding by the rigging, he would absently gaze off at the blank sea. At the presentation to him, then, of some minor matter interpreting the current of his thoughts, he would show more or less irascibility, but instantly he would control it. In the Navy, he was popularly known by the appellation Starry Vere. How such a designation happened to fall upon one who, whatever his sterling qualities, was without any brilliant ones, was in this wise. A favourite kinsman, Lord Denton, a free-hearted fellow, had been the first to meet and congratulate him upon his return to England from his West Indian cruise, and but the day previous, turning over a copy of Andrew Marvell's poems, had lighted, not for the first time, however, upon the lines entitled Appleton House, the name of one of the seats of their common ancestor, a hero in the German wars of the 17th century, in which poem occur the lines: "This 'tis to have been from the first in a domestic heaven nursed, under the discipline severe of Fairfax and the Starry Vere." And so, upon embracing his cousin fresh from Rodney's great victory, wherein he had played so gallant a part, brimming over with just family pride in the sailor of their house, he exuberantly exclaimed, "Give ye joy, Ed, give ye joy, my Starry Vere." This got currency, and the novel prefix serving in familiar parlance readily to distinguish the Bellipotent's captain from another Vere, his senior, a distant relative, an officer of like rank in the navy. It remained permanently attached to the surname. 7. In view of the part that the commander of the Bellipotent plays in scenes shortly to follow, it may be well to fill out that sketch of him outlined in the previous chapter. Aside from his qualities as a sea officer, Captain Vere was an exceptional character. Unlike no few of England's renowned sailors, long and arduous service with single devotion to it had not resulted in absorbing and insulting the entire man. He had a marked leaning toward everything intellectual. He loved books, never going to sea without a newly replenished library, compact but of the best. The isolated leisure, in some cases so wearisome, falling at intervals to commanders even during a war cruise, never was tedious to Captain Vere. With nothing of that literary taste which less heeds the thing conveyed than the vehicle, his bias was toward those books to which very serious mind of superior order, occupying any active post of authority in the world, naturally inclines. Books treating of actual men and events, no matter of what era. History, biography, and unconventional writers like Montaigne, who, free from cant and convention, honestly and in the spirit of common sense, philosophize upon realities. In this line of reading he found confirmation of his own more reserved thoughts, confirmation which he had vainly sought in social converse, so that as touching most fundamental topics there had got to be established in him some positive convictions which he forefelt would abide in him essentially unmodified so long as his intelligent part remained unimpaired. In view of the troubled period in which his lot was cast, this was well for him. His settled convictions were as a dike against those invading waters of novel opinion, social, political, and otherwise, which carried away, as in a torrent, no few minds in those days, minds by nature not inferior to his own, while other members of that aristocracy to which by birth he belonged were incensed at the innovators mainly because their theories were inimical to the privileged classes. Captain Vere disinterestedly opposed them, not alone because they seemed to him insusceptible of embodiment in lasting institutions, but at war with the peace of the world and the true welfare of mankind. With minds less stored than his, and less earnest, some officers of his rank, with whom at times he would necessarily consort, found him lacking in the companionable quality, a dry and bookish gentleman, as they deemed. Upon any chance withdraw from their company, one would be apt to say to another something like this: "There is a noble fellow, Starry Vere." Spite the gazettes, Sir Horatio, meaning him who became Lord Nelson, is at bottom scarce a better seaman or fighter. But between you and me now, don't you think there is a queer streak of the pedantic running through him? Yes, like the king's yarn in a coil of navy rope. Some apparent ground there was for this sort of confidential criticism, since not only did the captain's discourse never fall into the jocosely familiar, but in illustrating of any point touching the stirring personages and events of the time, he would be as apt to cite some historic character or incident of antiquity as he would be to cite from the moderns. He seemed unmindful of the circumstance that to his bluff company such remote allusions, however pertinent they might really be, were altogether alien to men whose reading was mainly confined to the journals. But considerateness in such matters is not easy to natures constituted like Captain Vere's. Their honesty prescribes them directness, sometimes far-reaching, like that of a migratory fowl that in its flight never heeds when it crosses a frontier. The lieutenants and other commissioned gentlemen forming Captain Vere's staff it is not necessary here to particularize, nor needs it to make any mention of any of the warrant officers. But among the petty officers was one who, having much to do with the story, may as well be forthwith introduced. His portrait I essay, but shall never hit it. This was John Claggart, the Master-at-Arms. But that sea title may, to landsmen, seem somewhat equivocal. Originally, doubtless, that petty officer's function was the instruction of the men in the use of arms, sword or cutlass. But very long ago, owing to the advance in gunnery, making hand-to-hand encounters less frequent, and giving to nitre and sulphur the preeminence over steel, that function ceased. The master-at-arms of a great warship becomes a sort of chief of police, charged, among other matters, with the duty of preserving order on the populous lower gun decks. Claggart was a man about 35, somewhat spare and tall, yet of no ill figure upon the whole. His hand was too small and shapely to have been accustomed to hard toil. The face was a notable one, the features, all except the chin, cleanly cut as those on a Greek medallion, yet the chin, beardless as Tecumseh's, had something of strange protuberant broadness in it, making that recalled the prints of the Reverend Dr. Titus Oates, the historic deponent, with the clerical drawl in the time of Charles II, and the fraud of the alleged Popish plot. It served Claggart in his office that his eye could cast a tutoring glance. His brow was of the sort phrenologically associated with more than average intellect, silk and jet curls partly clustering over it, making it foil to the pallor below, a pallor tinged with a faint shade of amber akin to the hue of time-tinted marbles of old. This complexion singularly contrasting with the red or deeply bronzed visages of the sailors, and in part the result of his official seclusion from the sunlight, though it was not exactly displeasing, nevertheless, seemed to hint of something defective or abnormal in the constitution and blood. But his general aspect and manner were so suggestive of an education and career incongruous with his naval function that when not actively engaged in it, he looked like a man of high quality, social and moral, who for reasons of his own was keeping incog. Nothing was known of his former life. It might be that he was an Englishman, and yet there lurked a bit of accent in his speech, suggesting that possibly he was not such by birth, but through naturalization in early childhood. Among certain grizzled sea gossips of the gun decks and forecastle went a rumour perdue that the master-at-arms was a chevalier who had volunteered into the King's Navy by way of compounding for some mysterious swindle whereof he had been arraigned at the King's Bench. The fact that nobody could substantiate this report was of course nothing against its secret currency. Such a rumour, once started on the gun decks in reference to almost anyone below the rank of a commissioned officer, would during the period assigned to this narrative have seemed not altogether wanting in credibility to the tarry old wise acres of a man-of-war crew. And indeed a man of Claggart's accomplishments, without prior nautical experience, entering the Navy at mature life as he did, and necessarily allotted at the start to the lowest grade in it, a man, too, who never made allusion to his previous life ashore, these were circumstances which, in the dearth of exact knowledge as to his true antecedents, opened to the invidious a vague field for unfavorable surmise. But the sailors' dog-watch gossip concerning him derived a vague plausibility from the fact that now for some period the British Navy could so little afford to be squeamish in the matter of keeping up the muster rolls, that not only were press gangs notoriously abroad, both afloat and ashore, but there was little or no secret about another matter, namely, that the London police were at liberty to capture any able-bodied suspect, any questionable fellow at large, and summarily ship him to the dockyard or fleet. Furthermore, even among voluntary enlistments, there were instances where the motive thereto partook neither of patriotic impulse nor yet of a random desire to experience a bit of sea life and martial adventure. Insolvent debtors of minor grade, together with the promiscuous lame ducks of morality, found in the Navy a convenient and secure refuge, secure because once enlisted aboard a king's ship, they were as much in sanctuary as the transgressor of the Middle Ages, harboring himself under the shadow of the altar. Such sanctioned irregularities, which for obvious reasons the government would hardly think to parade at the time, and which consequently, and as affecting the least influential class of mankind, have all but dropped into oblivion, lend color to something for the truth, whereof I do not vouch, and hence have some scruple in stating something I remember having seen in print, though the book I cannot recall. But the same thing was personally communicated to me no more than 40 years ago by an old pensioner in a cocked hat with whom I had a most interesting talk on the terrace at Greenwich, a Baltimore negro, a Trafalgar man. It was to this effect: in the case of a warship short of hands whose speedily sailing was imperative, the deficient quota, in lack of any other way of making it good, would be eked out by drafts called direct from the jails. For reasons previously suggested, it would not perhaps be easy at the present day directly to prove or disprove the allegation. But allowed as a verity, how significant would it be of England's straits at the time confronted by those wars which, like a flight of harpies, rose shrieking from the din and dust of the fallen Bastille? The error appears measurably clear to us who look back at it, and but read of it. But to the grandfathers of us greybeards, the more thoughtful of them, the genius of it presented an aspect like that of Camoens's Spirit of the Cape, an eclipsing menace mysterious and prodigious. Not America was exempt from apprehension. At the height of Napoleon's unexampled conquest, there were Americans who had fought at Bunker Hill, who looked forward to the possibility that the Atlantic might prove no barrier against the ultimate schemes of the French portentous upstart from the revolutionary chaos, who seemed in act of fulfilling judgment prefigured in the apocalypse. But the less credence was to be given to the gun-deck talk touching Claggart, seeing that no man hold his office in a man-o'-war can ever hope to be popular with the crew. Besides, in derogatory comments upon anyone against whom they have a grudge, or for any reason or no reason mislike, sailors are much like landsmen. They are apt to exaggerate or romance it. About as much was really known to the bellipotents tars of the master-at-arms career before entering the service as an astronomer knows about a comet's travel prior to its first observable appearance in the sky. The verdict of the sea quidnuncs had been cited only by way of showing what sort of moral impression the man made upon rude, uncultivated natures whose conceptions of human wickedness were necessarily of the narrowest, limited to ideas of vulgar rascality, a thief among the swinging hammocks during a night watch, or the man-brokers in and landsharks of the seaports. And in case anyone was curious about that word, quidnuncs, it's Quidnuncs. You work it out. It was no gossip, however, but fact that though, as before hinted, Claggart, upon his entrance into the Navy, was, as a novice, assigned to the least honourable section of a man-of-war's crew. Embracing the drudgery, he did not long remain there. The superior capacity he immediately evinced, his constitutional sobriety, and ingratiating deference to superiors, together with a peculiar ferreting genius manifested on a singular occasion, all this, capped by a certain austere patriotism, abruptly advanced him to the position of master-at-arms. Of this maritime chief of police, the ship's corporals, so called, were the immediate subordinates and compliant ones, and this, as is to be noted in some business departments ashore, almost to a degree inconsistent with entire moral volition. His place put various converging wires of underground influence under the chief's control, capable, when astutely worked through his understrappers, of operating to the mysterious discomfort, if nothing worse, of any of the sea commonalty. Like in the foretop, well agreed with Billy Budd, there, when not actually engaged on the yards yet higher aloft, the topman, who as such had been picked out for youth and activity, constituted an area club, lounging at ease against the smaller stun sails, rolled up into cushions, spinning yards like the crazy gods, and frequently amused with what was going on in the busy world of the decks below. No wonder, then, that a young fellow of Billy's disposition was well content in such society. Giving no cause of offence to anybody, he was always alert at a call. So in the merchant service it had been with him, but now such punctiliousness in duty was shown that the topmates would sometimes good-naturedly laugh at him for it. This heightened alacrity had its cause, namely the impression made upon him by the first formal gangway punishment he had ever witnessed, which befell the day following his impressment. It had been incurred by a little fellow, young, a novice after-guardsman, absent from his assigned post when the ship was being put about, a dereliction resulting in a rather serious hitch to the maneuver, one demanding instantaneous promptitude in letting go and making fast. When Billy saw the culprit's naked back under the scourge, gridironed with red welts and worse, when he marked the dire expression in the liberated man's face, as with his woolen shirt flung over him by the executioner, he rushed forward from the spot to bury himself in the crowd. Billy was horrified. He resolved that never through remissness would he make himself liable to such a visitation, or do or omit aught that might merit even verbal reproof. What then was his surprise and concern when ultimately he found himself getting into petty trouble occasionally about such matters as the stowage of his bag, or something amiss in his hammock, matters under the police oversight of the ship's corporals of the lower decks, and which brought down on him a vague threat from one of them. So heedful in all things as he was, how could this be? He could not understand it, and it more than vexed him. When he spoke, To his young topmates about it they were either lightly incredulous or found something comical in his unconcealed anxiety. "Is it your bag, Billy?" said one. "Well, sew yourself up in it, bully boy, and then you'll be sure to know if anyone meddles with it." Now there was a veteran aboard who, because his years began to disqualify him for more active work, had been recently assigned duty as main mastman in his watch, looking to the gear belayed at the rail roundabout that great spar near the deck. At off times the foretopman had picked up some acquaintance with him, and now, in his trouble, it occurred to him that he might be the sort of person to go to the wise counsel. He was an old dankster, long anglicized in the service, of few words, many wrinkles, and some honorable scars. His wizened face, time-tinted and weather-stained to the complexion of an antique parchment, was here and there peppered blue by the chance explosion of a gun cartridge in action. He was an Agamemnon man, some 2 years prior to the time of this story, having served under Nelson when still captain in that ship immortal in naval memory, which, dismantled and in part broken up to her bare ribs, is seen a grand skeleton in Haydn's etching. As one of the boarding party from the Agamemnon, he had received a cut slantwise along one temple and cheek, leaving a long pale scar like a streak of dawn's light falling athwart the dark visage. It was on account of that scar, and the affair in which it was known that he had received it, as well as from his blue-peppered complexion, that the Dansker went among the Bellepotent's crew by the name of Board Her in the Smoke. Now, the first time that his small weasel eyes happened to light on Billy Budd, a certain grim internal merriment set all his ancient wrinkles into antic play. Was it that his eccentric, unsentimental old sapience, primitive in its kind, saw or thought it saw something which, in contrast with the warship's environment, looked oddly incongruous in the handsome sailor? But after slyly studying him at intervals, the old Merlin's equivocal merriment was modified, for now, when the twain would meet, it would start in his face a quizzing sort of look, but it would be but momentary, and sometimes replaced by an expression of speculative query as to what might eventually befall a nature like that, dropped into a world not without some man-traps, and against whose subtleties simple courage, lacking experience and address, and without any touch of defensive ugliness, is of little avail, and where such innocence as man is capable of does yet, in a moral emergency, not always sharpen the faculties or enlighten the will. However it was, the Dansker, in his aesthetic way, rather took to Billy, nor was this only because of a certain philosophic interest in such a character. There was another cause. While the old man's eccentricities, sometimes bordering on the ursine, repelled the juniors, Billy, undeterred thereby, revering him as a salt hero, would make advances, near passing the old Agamemnon man without a salutation marked by the respect which is seldom lost on the aged, however crabbed at times or whatever their station in life. There was a vein of dry humor, or what-not, in the maskman, and whether in freak of patriarchal irony touching Billy's youth and athletic frame, or for some other and more recondite reason, from the first, in addressing him, he always substituted baby for Billy, the Dansker, in fact, being the originator of the name by which the foretopman eventually became known aboard ship. Well then, in his mysterious little difficulty going in quest of the wicked one, Billy found him off duty in a dog watch, ruminating by himself, seated on a shot box of the upper gun deck, now and then surveying with a somewhat cynical regard certain of the more swaggering promenaders there. Billy recounted his trouble again, wondering how it all happened. The salt-seer attentively listened, accompanying the foretopman's recital with queer twitchings of his wrinkles and problematical little sparkles of his small ferret eyes. Making an end of his story, the foretopman asked, "And now, Dansker, do tell me what you think of it." The old man, shoving up the front of his tarpaulin and deliberately rubbing the long slant scar at the point where it entered the thin hair, laconically said, "Baby Bud, Jemmy Legs," meaning the master-at-arms, "is down on you." "Jemmy Legs?" ejaculated Billy, his welkin eyes expanding. "What for?" "Why, he calls me the sweet and pleasant young fellow, they tell me." "Does he so?" grinned the grizzled one, then said, "Aye, baby lad, a sweet voice has Jemmy Legs." "No, not always, but to me he has. I seldom pass him but there comes a pleasant word. And that's because he's down upon you, baby bud." Such reiteration, along with the manner of it, incomprehensible to a novice, disturbed Billy almost as much as the mystery for which he had sought explanation. Something less unpleasantly oracular he tried to extract, but the old sea sharon, thinking perhaps that for the nonce he was sufficiently instructed, his young Achilles, pursed his lips, gathered all his wrinkles together, and would commit himself to nothing further. Years and those experiences which befall certain shrewder men, subordinated lifelong to the will of superiors, all this had developed in the Dansker the pithy, guarded cynicism that was his leading characteristic. End of Part 9. Part 10. The next day an incident served to confirm Billy Budd in his incredulity as to the Dansker's strange summoning of the case submitted. The ship at noon, going large before the wind, was rolling on her course, and he below at dinner, and engaged in some sportful talk with the members of his mess, chanced in a sudden lurch to spill the entire contents of his soup-pan upon the new scrubbed deck. Claggart, the master-at-arms, official rattan in hand, happened to be passing along the battery in a bay of which the mess was lodged, and the greasy liquid streamed across his path. Stepping over it, he was proceeding on his way without comment, since the matter was nothing to take notice of under the circumstances, when he happened to observe who it was that had done the spilling. His countenance changed. Pausing, he was about to ejaculate something hasty at the sailor, but checked himself, and pointing down to the streaming soup, playfully tapped him from behind with his rattan, saying in a low musical voice peculiar to him at times, "Handsomely done, my lad. And handsome is as handsome did it, too." And with that passed on. Not noted by Billy as not coming within his view was the involuntary smile, or rather grimace, that accompanied Claggart's equivocal words. Aridity it drew down the thin corners of his shapely mouth, but everybody taking his remark as meant for humorous, and at which, therefore, as coming from a superior, they were bound to laugh with counterfeited glee, acted accordingly, and Billy, tickled, it may be, by the illusion of his being the handsome sailor, merely joined in, then addressing his messmates, exclaimed, "There now, who says that Jemmy Legs is down on me?" "And who said he was, Beauty?" demanded one Donald with some surprise. Whereat the four topmen looked a little foolish, recalling that it was only one person. "Bored her in the smoke," who had suggested what to him was the smoky idea that this master-at-arms was in any peculiar way hostile to him. Meantime, that functionary, resuming his path, must have momentarily worn some expression less guarded than that of the bitter smile, usurping the face from the heart, some distorted expression, perhaps, for a drummer-boy heedlessly frolicking along from the opposite direction and chancing to come into light collision with his person was strangely disconcerted by this his aspect. Nor was the impression lessened when the official, impetuously giving him a sharp cut with the rattan, vehemently exclaimed, "Look where you go!"